Welcome to this video about Azure Arc Resource Bridge for Azure Stack HCI. My name is Manfred Helber, and I say welcome to Bernhard Frank from Microsoft. Hello, Bernhard.
Hello, I am Bernhard Frank, customer engineer here at Microsoft in the Azure Fast Track team.
Yeah, and I mentioned my name is Manfred Helber. I'm Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center, and I'm doing Azure Stack HCI workshops, demos, videos like this on a daily basis. And today we want to focus on the deployment of Azure Arc Resource Bridge for Azure Stack HCI. It's a very, very interesting, fascinating topic, and we think that the person who is watching this video already knows what Azure Arc Resource Bridge for Azure Stack HCI is. If not, we will produce a second video where we explain what the resource bridge is for and what we can do with the resource bridge. Today, we will really focus on the deployment because there is a deployment based on Windows Admin Center, and we discussed this, Bernhard. I used this deployment successful, but I also had several deployments with Windows Admin Center that were not successful. And there the issue is that we have a huge wizard with many single steps that deploys a whole script at the end. And if it runs into an issue, it's very, very complicated to find the problem, to solve the problem, and to roll it back. And so it's much easier to do it via PowerShell if we expect any errors. Maybe it's not easier, but if in the PowerShell, this is what we will see in your live demo then. In the PowerShell, we have the ability to run it in single steps, and where we can see for each step if it's successful, and if not, we can work on exactly this step. In the Windows Admin Center deployment, we have a wizard that collects every information, and then we have the deployment at the end. And so this is the reason why we are running the deployment in this video via PowerShell, because the deployments we had already have shown that this is the actually recommended option. If the wizard in Windows Admin Center changes, maybe we'll also produce a video where we showcase the Windows Admin Center steps. So, and because the deployment lasts some time, you have pre-produced, Bernhard, a video, correct? Yeah.
Yes, I have pre-produced the video, and I think it's good to have both of us in the call, not to have only a single voice talking over the single steps, because it is PowerShell. That could be a little bit boring if you only hear one voice. So that's why we try to make it a little bit more lively with maybe some questions and answers and some troubleshooting tips. Yes, I want to add only a small things before we jump into the video. Which is also PowerShell. You can replay this if you have it baked in code. If something goes wrong, you can fine tune and tweak a little bit maybe on your settings and then rerun it, right? Doesn't mean that you have to reinstall your full HCI cluster. No, you just get rid of the components that have been installed before regarding AKS and the Azure Resource Bridge, and then you'll start over again, right? And I'll do that really a couple of times because you probably won't get it right for the first time. With that, Manfred, if you could switch to the video, then we can kick it off.
I will do so. The reason for the video, to mention this again, is that we can skip the time periods where we have downloads, where we have time to wait. And so this is the reason for the video. The steps are proven, they are tested, so this will work. And if you are not the guy that is working on PowerShell on a daily basis, you for sure can also use the repository Bernhard has prepared. So we have the situation that you don't have to type the full code, but Bernhard will display this. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so let's start. And there's another more important reason for using PowerShell as well, right? Which is the Azure Resource Bridge relies on Kubernetes. And it would bring its own Kubernetes to only provide the Azure Resource Bridge functionality. However, I would assume that there are many people out there that want to have Kubernetes and the Azure Resource Bridge to be usable for them. So if you want to have a side-by-side installation where you can have access to the Kubernetes in order for spinning up containers for your developers, then the only way currently is to use PowerShell to set both things up so that they are can live side by side. All right. Okay, so let's start the video. And let me, I think the first thing is where I show you the code on a single node, or I do have a cluster which which consists of two nodes. And what I do is, I start another PowerShell session. I don't do it in the black console because some things, will take some wait time. So I don't want to block my black PowerShell console. The code which we are going to run, or which I'm going to run in that video, is on this public available GitHub repository. So if you want to replay this, just copy out the URL from the top and then bring it to the raw format and then do a copy and paste of the whole code to a notepad that you can open off one of the nodes, right? The script is not meant to be run in, from top to bottom. So I arranged it in sort of snippets, right? And try to execute these snippets once in a while. I mean, the code is not so polished that it's, because it will require some input from you when it comes, for example, to the IP address ranges, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There are components regarding the installation, and these require the new package provider or the latest package provider for PowerShell, and that's what I do. For this one to become active, you need to close the actual shell, that's the exit command, and then restart or relaunch a new shell so that the PowerShell get, will be loaded into this. Okay. So the next step would be, I'll try to, do the get module. If it's not loaded, you should be able to do a get module with the PowerShell get module, and then do a list available, which should give you the one that is being installed. So you have the old one and the new one, which we currently installed right there. Okay, so that's preparation work. And then we need to install the components for installing AKS, right? So that's the benefit of AKS on-prem. Our developers, have assembled a PowerShell module that eases the installation of AKS on-prem, right? So there are lots of different components that need to be taken care of, and we'll see that during the installation, right? And this is currently being downloaded on with that command.
Yeah, maybe we can do a short break, Bernhard, because the AKS module, you mentioned that we will install both an AKS cluster and the Azure Arc Resource Bridge, because there are some dependencies. We have to deploy the AKS cluster and then the bridge to be able to use both. But this module is the same module we need for the Azure Arc Resource Bridge, correct? So we need to download this also if we decide only to deploy the Azure Arc Resource Bridge, correct?
Not especially this one, but it
okay,
has
this
also
is especially for the AKS cluster. Okay,
yeah.
Yeah.
But it also has other ones. For example, the underlying platform, the mock module, which is the Microsoft on-premise cloud agent. This is the same. So they are sort of, they have, it's not a, it's a shared shared resources that you're downloading here. So if you would only do the Azure Resource Bridge installation, some parts, it would be a different command. It would be Arc HCI instead of AKS HCI, but it would also tie in some resources that this command downloads, right?
Okay, perfect.
So, for example, if you do a get command on this one, you see that there are a lot of commands out there that deal with the AKS installation. So looking at one of the nodes, or at the node where I installed this, you could see it. You have the Azure AKS module, for example, right? But the one that I've currently installed is the AKS HCI module, which is for our HCI system, right? There are other ones that have been downloaded, which is the mock one and the KVA module. From the time window, you could see, at that time, that these are the ones that I just downloaded. Okay. So next, I do have a helper function created. So what does this one do? When you write scripts, you could either, do a lot of hard coding with variables. So to say that you, for example, what is the resource group name? You could hard code the resource group name, right? However, it would be a little bit complicated to do that multiple times, and I don't want to overboard my code. So I'm using a get option function, which does basically the following. It takes two parameters. The first one is the PowerShell command that you want to run, and the second one is sort of the filter, I'm filtering for the process names in the get process command. And the get option function just gives me an easy way of selecting a number, and then I'll get the return value back, which I can then fill into a variable, right? So either use the get option function that I provided, or do hard coding. That's up to you, right? So the next step would be to log on to your Azure subscription. That should be the target for your AKS resources. It doesn't mean that your AKS will run in Azure. No, it will run on premise, but we will register your AKS to Azure, right? Because we are, relying on billing information. Maybe you want to see in Azure if your AKS system is still up and running, or you want to do a remote administration, right? So therefore, you need.
When we can have a short break here, Bernhard, in the video, because you already had your credentials entered in this browser window.
Yes.
This is usually the Azure tenant you also used for registering your Azure Stack HCI cluster. So we expect that you have an Azure Stack HCI cluster running. You already registered this cluster in Azure, and you usually will use this tenant and the tenant information for doing this registration steps here and connection steps. So it depends on your environment what you will enter there.
Yeah, this is an important one. Thanks for bringing that up. And it should not, live in different subscriptions or even in different tenants. And sometimes it's useful for, using an incognito session within the browser first to make sure that you are in the right subscription, especially if you have multiple identities or multiple subscriptions, right? So just make sure that you have the right permission. Then the next thing, what happens is to register the resource providers. These ones provide functionality within your subscription. They would usually, be registered automatically, but you can speed up the process, avoid some error messages if you do it beforehand, right? Then there is another command which is an initialize AKS HCI node. And you should run this on every node. And you could see it from the output that this one is pretty chatty, right? And this was the line verbose preference continue, right? Because Manfred said we are using PowerShell to see any errors, right? Because WAC doesn't give us too much output. If you do the verbose preference to continue, you get a lot of output, which could help you in troubleshooting. So there, this is the process. And we do that on every node. So let's do this on the other node as well. I'm not 100% sure if you really require this because the initialize command, basically what it does, it just checks if Windows remoting is enabled on the other node. So that you can, during the AKS setup, do some things, right? However, this command is part of the PowerShell module we have installed before on the other node. So, we need to install the same PowerShell module on this node as well if we want to run a command from it. And that's basically what I do. So I do sort of a replay of what we've just done on node number 1, now on node number 2, right? Again, I'm not 100% sure that you really require this, but I would say it's recommended and best practice to do so, right? So I think I've speeded or I accelerated this a little bit in the video maybe, and do a switch over to the other node probably relatively fast, right? So this should be done by you guys, okay? Okay, let's probably switch then to the other node.
So this was now on the second node, and then you're coming back to the first node and continuing with the next steps, correct?
Right. So this is the command, right? So the other one was the preparing, and this is the command for installing the module, and then I'll do the switch to the other one after the initialize AKS HCI node. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm also not sure about this, but I would absolutely recommend to have the configuration on both nodes. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's just copy the code for doing the initialize, and then we'll do the switch to the original node again. Okay. Good. The next steps would be to have some preparation to be done, right? So we need to tell AKS a little bit about our scenario or our environment, and this is the section here. So first of all, we need to tell it about the Hyper-V switch that we are about to use. Well, why? Because we are spinning up virtual machines that run AKS on your HCI, and these virtual machines need to be connected to the outside world, right? And therefore, it needs to know which Hyper-V switch it should use, right? And that's that command. That's this command. I'm using my get option function for querying the switch, right? I do have two. I'm selecting the first one, the compute switch. It may look different on your system. The naming may look different, right? Depending on what you have done. So select the one that can talk to the outside world, right? It needs to talk to the internet also, because it needs to download stuff from the internet, and it also needs to register to Azure. So make sure that you do that. So now, very important part here, right? We do need to fill in some names. For example, a DNS server. Okay, my DNS server is also the domain controller, and me being the domain admin on this one. So I can make entries to the DNS server, and I can create objects within my AD. Why is this important? Because we will see during the installation that there is a role being generated in our failover cluster, which relies on a computer object which is located in our Active Directory. If I haven't pre-created it, it will be created for me. If I lack the permissions to do so, installation will fail, right? And I'm being very open on this, because this is one error types that we see quite often here in the fast track team, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's based on permissions, and we discussed this before. When a customer moves the resources to another organization unit in Active Directory, we have to ensure that in this organization unit, in the Active Directory infrastructure, we also have set the permissions on this object in the hierarchy. So it depends on your environment. So in the steps we see, we expect that you have the cluster objects still in the computer's container.
Yeah, that was, my demo environment is fairly easy. You could see it from the IP address ranging. It's a flat network, right? I do have a Class C network. Every component is in that network. That doesn't mean that you have to do it that way, right? But it for proof of concepts is the easiest thing. So most important is you have a DNS server, right, which is maybe your domain controller where you have the rights to add entries, or you're working with pre-created accounts. Next thing, the DNS server can resolve internet names because you want to go to Azure for subscription, registration, downloading stuff. And then you need to have a gateway for talking to the outside world, right? So this is an existing router, for example, on your environment. And then there is another IP, which is not given away, which is a free IP, right? So this is not taken by anything else on your network. This is an IP address that will be used for this generic service within the failover cluster, right?
Mm-hmm.
So make sure that you have specified a free IP. So the other two, the gateway and DNS server, are already there. The cloud service IDR is free, right? Then you do have other IP addresses, the KS node IP pool, the VIP IP pool. So think about this. So this could be different IP addresses, or they don't need to sit on the same network as the cloud service IDR, right? So the cloud service IDR that I mentioned before needs to sit on the same network as your management nodes or as your HCI nodes, right? The management network of the HCI nodes. Why? Because this will be the generic role which will be created. If that's a different IP address that doesn't sit on any cluster network, it will fail. It will tell you, hey, I can't reach that, right? The KS or the VIP pools and the K8S node IP pools are pools, IP addresses that are free, not taken by anyone else, for virtual machines, for AKS to use to spin up their cluster, right? And they could be different from the other range. However, you need to make sure that the node that you are using to install that can talk to the IP addresses that you're using for the virtual machines, right? For these K8 nodes, so they need to talk to these ones. Why? We'll see that later on, because this node configures something that will happen within that virtual machines. But we'll see that later on, right? So let's have a look at these commands here. We are setting the variables. Then with that command, we are, doing the configuration file. Some validation takes place. You can use VLANs, right? If you are using VLANs on your management network or on the other ones, then please feel free to set a VLAN ID. Within that very command here that I'm currently highlighting, the set AKS HCI config, this is actually writing the config. It does do some validation of the settings that you have done before. This is the first step that can go wrong then. If you run into any errors here, make sure that you really read the details, what happens, right? So from there, you could see that something is written on your cluster shared volume that you have specified for AKS to be used. Quite a bit what is there, right? And there are also some config files which contain the networking information that we just entered. They should now be persisted there. Next thing.
The volume you are using, Bernhard, is it recommended to use a dedicated volume for AKS, or can it be the same one we are using for the resource bridge deployment? Are there any recommendations on this?
I use the same one. I think it would, for a proof of concept, I was sort of lazy to use the same one. I also use the same one for my Azure Resource Bridge. I'm not so well equipped with disks, so I don't have too many CSVs. And I think you can separate then later on the workloads to different CSVs, which I would do. But for proof of concept, I think it's fine to do so.
I think it's a question on the scale we plan for AKS and for the rest of our environment. The important information is it's possible to use the same volume. So as Bernhard mentioned, especially if it's a test, a proof of concept, you can use this single volume, and it's not required to have dedicated volumes for each of these deployed services. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Then next thing is the resource group, which we want to be used for registering our AKS system, right? As said before, it's a hybrid service. We build this hybrid wise. That means, based on the consumption and how many nodes of AKS you want to run on premise, this will show up in your Azure subscription. The frame or the container where this resource lives in is a resource group, and this is the thing that I have selected here. Next, there is a command which is the snippet 6, which does two things. It does first the set the Arc or the AKS HCI registration. This one brings up another authentication prompt or a device login. So I'm not quite sure. It could have used the previous or the current context. However, the logic of this command is that it brings really a new window up. That's the way it is. And the next command is the install AKS HCI command, which does actually a lot of things, which does the install then. So we will see that from now. And you could see that it does have some cleanup routines starting. So you see deprovisioning things before, right? So if something is not there, or some remnants of previous deployments are there, they would be cleaned up. And then if done so, things will be kicked off, for example, downloading some resources from the internet, right? So you could see that things are copied. For example, the WSS agent, which is, the generic service is a piece of code or a piece of is an executable that is being downloaded from the internet. Hence, you need to have connectivity to the outside world. One other common area of errors is you may have a firewall in between which blocks downloads, right? So let me stop here. And this, for example, right? So if you have any firewalls blocking your HCI nodes from downloading resources from the internet, then you need to specify these URLs. There are lists for URLs to be opened in order that you can download these resources.
Mm-hmm. I think we have to bring another information at this point, Bernhard, because you are switching between systems with a graphical user interface and the nodes themselves. And I was thinking about this when you use the web browser, because actually we are using failover cluster manager and so on. We can see this in the video. I think this is some management host you are running, Bernhard, correct?
Yes, sorry
and
for...
we explained it that we had the node 1 and node 2 with the script things, but your Edge browser session was on this management node, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Sorry for not mentioning this. So I have two nodes, two headless systems, HCI systems, which are sort of remote managed from an admin box, which is on the other side. This one is a Windows server with Windows Admin Center installed, right? It has the tools like Failover Cluster Manager and my Azure portal open. And sometimes I switch around to show and demonstrate things which happen on the nodes, right? Because sometimes it would be difficult to always see on the black screen, right?
So whenever you see a graphical user interface, except the PowerShell, it's also graphical, and except the notepad, this is on the nodes themselves. But for example, also the Edge browser session was on this machine here.
Yep.
And so it's not required to have a browser on the nodes themselves.
Yep. So currently we are looking, I have stopped the deployment or the video. We are looking what happened, right? So if you press install AKS HCI, it will, kick after the settings, it will kick things off registering, downloading the generic service resources, and this is the generic service that will be created for you within your failover cluster, within your HCI cluster, right? So let's have a look at this one. Most interestingly is the IP address that this one uses, right? And you know this one because we have specified it before in our variable file, right? So this is set in our variable file at this stage. It's the cloud service IDR, right? And this one needs to sit on the same network as the HCI nodes sit on. Here is a view on my computer's OU in AD, right? It doesn't have the complete name, right? So it's shortened, but you could see here that this object was not before there. It has been created during the setup process, right? If you want to work with pre-staged accounts, you can do so, even with in different OUs. However, the command for using it or for reusing would be, you would need to specify this in the set AKS HCI config command, right? So look up at the internet for that specific command. It's the cloud's role name switch that you need to add if you want to do so. Okay. This section currently is the generic service has been created. Now we need to create the virtual machine that contains the AKS components itself, right? The cloud service is relatively small in size. It would not be able to run the full AKS system. This is happening inside a virtual machine. And for that virtual machine, we need an operating system. And this is the download for this operating system. So you could see, if you already see at the bluish screen, that this is a Linux operating system. And sometimes it depends. The download may be a little bit flaky sometimes. So it does have a retry option. I had problems one time where even the retry did not work. So I was just relaunching the whole PowerShell script again some minutes later, and it worked. Right. So sometimes, also depending maybe on on your router, on your firewalls, on your proxies in between, and also on our internet connection, sometimes that it is not always that fast. Okay, so this Linux is special. It's a Maryland Linux, so it's a distribution that we as Microsoft, do or care, right? Which is, a couple or decades ago, 10 years ago, this would be really strange if someone would have told you that Microsoft does do their own Linux distribution. Hey, now we do, and this is the one, right? So it's a stripped down version, a hardened version that we are distributing and using for that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Once this is downloaded, checksum will be verified. The multiple streams that have been downloaded, will be concatenated to one virtual hard disk. So you could even see, the different zip files which are being downloaded and then concatenated to one VHDX file, which will then be used for creating a virtual machine out of it. And this virtual machine takes an IP address, right? So if you go to the section deploy appliance, or if you see deploying appliance, then you should see something happening within your failover cluster again, right? So now you see that this virtual machine is part of the cluster now. And if you look at your Hyper-V or launch, the console from your failover cluster, you could see, the Linux that is being spun up. Quite interestingly, right? So what happens there? You could verify the version, yeah, that takes some time. The next phase of the AKS setup would be to talk to that virtual machine. tunnel into the virtual machine, do an SSH into the virtual machine, and bring in some components. So let's wait here maybe shortly for the IP addresses that are being used by that virtual machine, because they are two, right? And if you go back to your IP address pool settings, you would see that one IP address is from the K8S, which is the abbreviation for Kubernetes IP pool, and the other one is for the VIP, the virtual IP address, or the public IP address that this machine gets to talk to the outside world. So it uses IP addresses from these ranges, if you spin up more Kubernetes workload clusters, they would also, take other IP addresses from these ranges. All right. There is also documentation out there for what these IP addresses are used for, right? Some of them are hosting APIs or control APIs that are being used for the cloud agent, the generic service, to talk to them, right? And some others are just used for other connectivity. So I would recommend to look up, to browse to the internet link, which I have mentioned in the code, to understand a little bit more what is behind these IP addresses, and maybe how many you should have for your environment, right? Because you need to do some reservings there. You need to some IP addresses, just to get an idea of how many you really need for your environment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Also, this one is interesting, the cluster API core. Now things happen inside of the virtual machine. Maybe you see also CPU usage of that virtual machine. So that could take a couple of minutes. And I think, this is not the live time of the video, because you could see that the timings there. So I accelerated the video a little bit. So this is not real time. I haven't cut out anything, but I have accelerated the video because there are wait times in between. For example, the Azure Arc onboarding phase for this Kubernetes cluster takes a couple of minutes, right? The component needs to come up within the virtual machine. It needs to find the Azure subscription, right? And therefore, I do the spinning around and show you how the Azure portal looks like, right? Within your Azure Arc blade, you could see then under Kubernetes cluster your successful cluster, right? And you could tell it which one it is, because the GUID that is being used is the same one, or should be the same one, right? Okay.
So this is a recommended step to find out if the registration was successful and if we can continue. Yeah.
Yeah, especially if you're troubleshooting, sometimes you lack permissions, right? Even for the registration part, if that happens, right, you may get an error message here saying that the registration failed, and therefore it would be, good to know at which kind of step it failed, right? What I just mentioned was this thing on top, right? So if you ever in that phase of installation jump into the bluish PowerShell window and do the, press the mouse button, it says it loses context, right? So the backend script execution is stopped, and you would see a select administrator, a select statement, and on the top of the window. Just be aware, if nothing is happening at all, right? Just release the execution by hitting enter again, right? And then the select goes away, and your script execution works just fine. That sometimes happens. So, and I thought it might be a good one to mention out here, because you don't want to your script or your installation to become bad because you just have paused the system, right? Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned the lack of permissions in Azure could be there, and we also have seen you are using some demo tenant there. Are there any recommendations for your side? Because I've seen this lack of permissions often in production scenarios, but I think if you implement this in a production environment, you will read through the documentation which permissions you need, and you will configure these permissions exactly there. But for a demo environment, are there any recommendations, Bernhard? You mentioned you're using some M365 demo tenant, yes?
Yeah, so I am full privileged. That means I'm owner of the subscription.
Yeah.
So that means I can set permissions, right? I can not only as a contributor would be able to create resources, but I would not be able to create permissions to these resources. As an owner, I can. However, I think you don't need to be owner on a subscription, right? Because you're just creating resources. The other thing is there's another, so that's for these subscription permissions, but there are also Azure Active Directory permissions or roles, right? And during the registration or with the usage of Azure Stack HCI, you are registering or you are creating applications. And most often, the rights for creating applications and spinning up permissions is really something that requires high privilege use. So if you don't want to run into any issues, make sure that you're a global admin of your Azure AD and also owner of your subscription, right? And you're fine. Everything else can lead to some point of troubleshooting, maybe, right? But there is a list of minimum required steps. However, it's not only AKS, it's HCI, it's the Arc Bridge that requires different permissions, maybe. So there are a lot of things happening in between. And depending on if you are doing a POC where you don't want to run into these issues, or if you want to, do a real-time implementation where you want to see these kind of issues, just make sure that you're, make sure that you spend your time wisely, right?
Yeah, I think to summarize this, the important message is that for permissions in Azure Active Directory and the Azure subscriptions, we could spend an additional hour or more in a video. So the recommendation is to use this high privileged environment if you want to save this time because it's a proof of concept or a test environment, and if you want to implement it based on best practices for production, you have to spend some additional time to work through these required privileges and maybe pre-configure the required objects in Azure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we have installed our Kubernetes system using PowerShell, right? So you could see and tell from the version that which version you got. And because this one is also important for you, the ones that are sorry for my camera, the ones that are administering AKS should do updates in regular times, right? Because we are updating the Kubernetes system, and therefore you should also update the Kubernetes version. Okay, so looking at the virtual machine, it might be, it comes up with 8 gig of memory with 4 processors. There might need to be some fine tuning to be done, maybe because you want to have your AKS system to have more power, to be more, vigilant. That can be done, right? From a Windows Admin Center's point of view, we are at this stage right now. So you should see your AKS master node, which is the section on top, right? It's not the Kubernetes clusters at the bottom, because these ones are the workload clusters. That are the ones for your developers, right? We only created the basics for your Kubernetes system, which is the upper part, right? And it's connected to Azure. We just registered it. We just seen it in our Azure subscription. And there you could see also the version of AKS and your Kubernetes version. If it comes to updates, go to the host settings. It's relatively easy to see the updates there, right? So maybe not at this time because we just installed it. We assume that we have the latest bits, right? But in maybe 2 weeks or 1 month time, there are already some updates, and you would have an update button here in order to get to the next version, right? Which you should do. So make sure that you're not passing out the update path. Another thing that might be interesting, which is, see on top that Windows Admin Center, I wouldn't say complains, but it mentions that there is an update available for my Azure Kubernetes plugin or for the extension. So that would be also a wise thing to do, to update this one, so to have the latest view, right? That works relatively fast, and within a mouse click, you should have the next step. Okay, so with this, we are done with the installation of Kubernetes. We could now go to the optional section or to the optional snippet that would create a workload cluster that you could give to your developers and say, hey guys, play with it, publish your containers on that. It will spin up another workload system which gets a name. It gets its own sets of credentials, right? So you could specify even the node count, how many virtual machines that are being spun up for executing their code. This is all done within these lines here, from these optional lines here, right? I would, skip that part for now because of saving some time. And the next thing would be to, now as we have Kubernetes up and running, we would then jump into the Azure Resource Bridge installation. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And to mention this again, we did the steps till now because it's not possible to do it in the other direction. So we cannot, yes, we can deploy the Azure Arc Resource Bridge first, but then we cannot deploy afterwards the infrastructure for the AKS. Yeah.
Yeah, we would not be able to. If we would do it, like this, that we spin up Azure Resource Bridge, it would be working fine. But, if any developer comes to you and say, hey, you have AKS on your system, haven't you? You would say, yeah, but I can't access it, right?
Yeah.
And you could not spin up workload clusters for him, right? In the way how we did it, you can, right? So that's the difference.
So this is part 2 of the deployment video for Azure Arc Resource Bridge on Azure Stack HCI. In the first part, we prepared everything in deploying an AKS cluster. We mentioned that this is the advantage that we can now also deploy containerized workloads, so AKS workloads there. And now we come to the, let's say, major step in deploying the Arc Resource Bridge. So welcome, Bernhard, back in the second part of the video. Yeah.
Yeah, you could have told it's a second part, another day, another video, because of my T-shirt color. So that changed. No matter. Let's see how we cut that piece together. So, okay, now let's kick off the second part to go into the section where we do install the resource bridge. So we skip the optional part and jump directly into the Azure Resource Bridge setup, right? So what we skipped was a Kubernetes workload cluster that you mentioned before, but we save time here and we start to do the Azure Resource Bridge setup. There we need to do some preparation work, right? Because a lot of the Azure Resource Bridge deployment is done through the Azure CLI. And I don't have the Azure CLI on the node, right? So that's what you see in red when trying to launch it. So therefore, I have the script snippet in the code that is provided on GitHub, where it just downloads the Azure CLI from the public download and installs it. And most importantly, which is kind of annoying, that the people that have built the install procedure have not added the path to the application within the environment variables. So that's why I'm setting these values as well. so that you don't have to type in all the long path to the Azure CLI, but you can launch it from the console there.
Mhm.
So
in the first part, we discussed in some steps if the action is necessary on one node or both nodes.
yep.
I think here it's again recommended to do it on both nodes, or it's
For
required on one node.
For the Azure CLI, I'm not quite sure. I think you should be good when only installing it on one node.
Okay.
For the PowerShell modules, I have seen issues that some things are not showing up in the Windows Admin Center portal because the modules are missing on one or the other node. But with the Azure CLI, I didn't experience something like this. So
Okay, perfect.
yep. Okay. So now let's start with doing some preparation work. So for example, we will be asked for some questions regarding how should the resource bridge be named, and also prepare some things like, for example, which switch should be used for for attaching the Azure Resource Bridge VM to, right? Like we did before with AKS, it's pretty similar, right? So you get another virtual machine with a Mariner Linux inside. It will be downloaded onto your cluster. It will also get IP addresses that we need to specify. And it needs to talk to the outside world. Therefore, it needs to be able to, to be connected to a switch, sort of. So some things are happening here. For example, what I did is I did some settings on the IP addresses, and I think the video is mentioning this part, and we jump back in the video where I do the settings. But one part of the setup is also to register the resource bridge against Azure, or to create resources in Azure that the resource bridge uses, and therefore we need to do the login to your Azure subscription again. As said, now that's a little bit of a different login because we are doing the AZ login, which is the Azure CLI, not the PowerShell login. And then we are registering some extensions that are needed, especially for the Azure Resource Bridge deployment, right? So you could tell it also from the names of the extensions. As this one is new, it doesn't have, the remove functionality, cannot find anything that isn't been installed. However, that's the recommended way of doing things. Why? Because some parts are, if you do it multiple times, it's good to, get rid of the old modules. There may have been updates and start with the new ones again. Okay. So here's the section where I'm, sort of talking you through of the settings that I did in the script, right? Here's, for example, the custom location name. And you may want to change this to your location name. Think of this like an Azure region where you have deployed your Azure Stack to, for example, or where you would, when you deploy a virtual machine in Azure, it asks you where in which region you want the virtual machine to be placed into. And you get a drop-down box. The names that you fill in here is sort of a similar thing, right? So the people that are deploying a virtual machine will be asked for where they want to deploy it to. And this is the name that is being presented to them in a drop-down box. So it may be a little bit more, useful naming for them. For example, data center, location, whatnot, right? But you'll see it later on when we do a demo on this one. Okay.
Yeah, but this is the great thing in the resource bridge, that we have this custom location. So we have something like an additional Azure region, but this is owned by ourselves. Yeah.
Yep. There's another question about the path where the resources should go into. It's also sitting on the cluster shared volume because every node as part of the cluster needs to access these resources. So therefore, another path needs to be provided. Then this is, like in the AKS setup, one of the most important parts, or where it can have a lot of errors. So I'll talk you through this again, because sometimes things are not so explained so explicitly on the public docs side. So as with AKS, you need to provide a DNS server that is your domain controller, where entries may be added. You also need to have a gateway that can be used for the virtual machine, for the Azure Resource Bridge virtual machine, to talk to the outside world, to download stuff from the internet. Therefore, it also needs the DNS server to resolve any FQDN names, any public internet names. And then you do have a control plane IP, which is not taken by anyone else yet. So it's a free IP address in your range that can be used for the API to talk to. Then you also do have the Kubernetes pools for the virtual machines. And I have quite a few IP addresses. So I have, about 9 IP addresses for one and 8 for the other pool. I don't think that you need so many. I would say you probably need only 1 or 2 IP addresses in each pool. I was a bit lazy in order specifying this, but when you set up the Azure Resource Bridge and then go into your Hyper-V manager, look at the virtual machine that is being created, it's just one. It's taking then some IP addresses, and you may want to fine-tune your settings here. Okay, so let's talk about this, or these are, and most importantly, these are different IP address ranges. So make sure they don't conflict with your AKS setup, right? Because I ended up doing this when I started to deploy it. I was producing a virtual machine that had duplicate IP addresses. So it was reusing IP addresses that has already been taken by the Kubernetes setup on top, right? And you don't want to have the same IP address used in 2 virtual machines. That may work sometimes, but you will see timing issues and these kind of things. You don't want to have this, right? So make sure they are separate from of each other. This is again the setting for baking the config file, which is then put onto disk for the resource bridge. And then later on, there is the setting for putting this into the the configuration in the virtual machine. So next phase is to I was removing some extensions that haven't been there. Okay, now I'm adding the latest ones, right? For making the Azure CLI being able to talk to and to provision Azure Resource Bridge components. To get them, some minor error here is okay. I was not updating the script. It was working like this in the past. However, this little error here is sort of expected unless I clean up my script and doesn't provide any issues, right? It's just a cosmetic thing here. Okay, so next thing is there are some sections that happen. Now, you see the prepare appliance. This is the time when something is being downloaded from the internet. It's the Mariner Linux again for the Azure Resource Bridge VM. And depending on the download link that you have, on the bandwidth that you have, it's either faster or slower. So I speeded that up. What we should see in a couple of seconds is that until they reach the final or the complete size, they will be concatenated to each other, and the virtual hard disk will be created out of it, right? And then some checksums will be done, or checking if you have downloaded the right stuff, and that's basically this step. There we go. Here's the virtual hard disk, and This one is laid aside, and in the next step, we will create the appliance out of it. Or produce, so this will be the deploy. And also depending on, the storage speed that you have on the, this can go or takes a while until the virtual machine is then spin up.
And I didn't get the size exactly you had, Bernhard, but I have also seen issues in my smaller demo environments with capacity, because you need the capacity for expanding and so on. So I think it's a good recommendation to ensure that you have enough space to do this all.
Yeah, it's not, a full-blown up disk. It's a dynamic disk that is being created, so it's not the full size of. So it's a dynamically expanding virtual hard disk, which is good, right? So what we see here is a second virtual machine that is spun up, right, with another GUID-like naming. So you end up in having two virtual machines with two Linuxes inside. One is for the AKS master node, and the other one is for the Azure Resource Bridge sort of master node, right? The size it has, the 8 gig of RAM, is the default setting that come with the Azure Resource Bridge PowerShell script that has been downloaded as part as well of the script, right? So it might be useful to do some fine tuning on later, right? Because I have seen Azure Resource Bridge VMs that are almost at the end of their capacity. So you have a lot of memory pressure seeing sometime, but that is something that you could figure out when you open the Windows Admin Center and have a look at your Azure Resource Bridge VM, right? If you experience that, you may shut it down, give it more memory and more CPU cores, and that should give you a little bit of a better performance when it comes to provisioning virtual machines, for example. Okay, so also one thing that happens here is, we are about to setting up the base requirements, or that is happening in, under the covers. And once you create the HCI Arc Bridge, then there are things happening inside of the virtual machine. So things are being downloaded to the extensions are being downloaded into the virtual machine. They take some time in order to come up, right? Then you do see some different phases of that process, right? So for example, you start with a waiting for heartbeat, then it's sort of going into the connecting state. After that, it's going to be in the connected state, and then the last state that we are waiting for is the running state. Right, so this can take up to a couple of minutes. So here you have the validating state, but this is the time where you can go into your Azure subscription and go under the Arc blade and see some things, right? So with here, wait a little bit, for stepping ahead, right? So the snippet 12 is the one that gives you the status, right? So it queries the object if it's in the state, or you can use the Azure portal for looking if it's a running state. So you do have two ways of doing that, right? But wait until it says running, right? So you may need to do it a couple of times, up to 5 minutes. And I think this is where I made a cut in the video and sort of advanced it a little bit forward in order to save some time. There is the status that we want to have, right? So running is the one where it says, hey, now we can do the remaining part, which is creating the HCI VM operator, which is an extension that is loaded inside of the Azure Resource Bridge VM. Also, it's a component that is being downloaded from a container registry that we provide. And this extension is the one that provides the functionality. So it's going to be also interesting which version this one has, right? The VM operator is the one that provides the functionality. For example, what can the Azure Resource Bridge do? Can I use, for example, VLANs? Can I, for example, use static IP addresses, for example? These kind of things. These are all, provided by the HCI VM operator. Okay, so might be a good thing in order to, check the version that is being imported there, and maybe, do the setup once in a while again to see which kind of functionality there is in. Okay. Next is if this is successful, then we need to create some resources, right? So one of the first resources we need to have is the custom location. You remember we filled in the value for the custom location before in a variable. This is actually the command that sets this custom location in your Azure subscription and ties it together with the Azure Resource Bridge, right? It's another resource or a sort of a placeholder, so nothing big is happening here. It's an object that is being created, so the creation should be relatively fast. And as well, what we want to see is the provisioning state succeeded. And I think I also show the Azure side of things. So you should, on the custom locations, now you should see after the refresh the value. And this should be, from the naming wise, should be one that is, self-explanatory for your users, right? That want to deploy resources. So the resources are going under the custom location. And what do I mean with the resources? Well, we are almost at the end of deploying the Azure Resource Bridge, but we need two requirements. One is we need a network to place virtual machines into, and the virtual machines need to be hooked up to a switch that exists on your HCI cluster, right? So the easiest way to do this is to provide to the custom location the switch name, exactly the same name as your switch is named on your Hyper-V or on your HCI system, right? And that's the easiest thing. Make sure that you, I would make sure that it is case sensitive, that you have, the capital letters right, because this is a Linux system, on a usual Windows system, I wouldn't care, but as the Azure Resource Bridge is running Linux, it might be picky on that one, or at least I experienced some pickiness on this one. So therefore, yeah, make sure that you have the case sensitive name here, which I do. Okay. Yeah, and when we have this is another resource that we should see in the Azure portal as well, under the custom location. So there you go. And what we do have missing, so is another thing, which is an image. So your virtual machines need to have an operating system. Where does that come from? And in my case, it's a self-provided image. So I do the virtual hard disk. I do, it's in my case, it's a sysprept Windows Server 22 that I put into that virtual hard disk. So it's sysprept, it's generalized, and I can create new virtual machines using that VHDX. How you do it, it's up to you.
Yeah, maybe you can pause the video, Bernhard, because I think this is an important step here to explain again that we have all the options we need on our on-premises Azure Stack HCI. So what you're showing is your own image that's dedicated for your company scenario with your applications. Bernhard mentioned it's a sys-prepped image because it's the template for new VMs, but you can have several of these images. So I'm often asked about things like we have in System Center Virtual Machine Manager with these VM templates, and with the what we see here, we can do similar things, and we use this as an template. And at Ignite, we had the announcement that it's also possible to use the image gallery. We already discussed this, Bernhard, that maybe we will do a second video where we explain how to work with the resource bridge. This was the first one where we said it's very important to explain the deployment, and then we will follow up in the next days or weeks and show you what's possible with the resource bridge. And it's also available via an easy download to download images from the Azure gallery. So you can choose the option you prefer. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was, a highly desired feature to download the images from the marketplace, right? Because we provide these images, we sort of update them on a regular basis, and also there are some images that are only in Azure available, right? For example, the Windows 11 multi-session OS, right, which you would be able to use if you run it on HCI, right, in an Azure Virtual Desktop kind of way. So yeah, as said, this is maybe you just not only want to have one image, so you may pass this code lines here multiple times, right, with different images depending on what you do, right? But you are the ones, so both sides, either if you're providing your custom images or if you are downloading the Azure Marketplace images, you can do a combination of both as well, right? Which is kind of cool because there you can do it either be in full control of the image or reuse the work from others, like from our marketplace, right? Okay, so let's kick it off. So there are some things that you need to tell Azure or the Azure Resource Bridge. So first of all, you need to tell it where you can find the virtual hard disk, because it's not uploaded to Azure in no way, right? You are creating on-prem virtual machines. Therefore, you need the image on-prem. It would not make sense, in taking it down every time you create a virtual machine from Azure. No, that would not be performant. So the Azure Resource Bridge takes the image from locally, but it needs to know where it can find it, right? And in my case, it's just sitting on a directory that I have also created on the cluster shared volume, which contains the virtual hard disk, right? And as said, I would keep it dynamically because there is no use in having big fixed size virtual hard disks that eat up the space on your cluster shared volume. That's why I prefer dynamically expanding disks. Then you give it a name. Also, remember the name that you specify here is one thing that the people will see in that drop-down box when selecting the operating system, right? So it should be self-explanatory what the people are getting if they are hitting that image. Also, as said, there is no upload taking place. So this is just a placeholder on object that is being created within your Azure subscription. Only has some values where to find it. So this should also be relatively fast. And once that's done, we are done, right? So there's only the test for if we can provision a virtual machine using the Azure Resource Bridge. So this is the final step in the deployment. And after that, yeah, we can give it a try and try to create a virtual machine from the Azure portal. So should we do that, Manfred, at this time? What do you think?
We can add this if we have some time left, Bernhard. Yes. and we can have this additional conversation where we can go deep in it if it's possible in your environment, because this is the reason why we did all these steps, why we did this deployment, to have this option. Yeah.
Okay, so let's put it or let's play the video, because I have baked it in there already. And let's talk that through, and then maybe we switch to the live environment and see what else we can do. Okay, so the steps are relatively easy or straightforward. So you jump in the Azure Arc Blade, go to the section where it has the Arc enabled virtual machines. There you have the create button, and then you end up in a sort of a similar experience than you would have for creating a regular virtual Azure VM. However, it's not Azure, it's on-prem, right? Even if, let me pause here for a second, even if you are creating these resources on-prem, you still have some objects that are being created in your Azure subscription, right? They are only placeholders, but you see them, and these placeholders can then be used for giving permissions to, for example, or doing actions like start a virtual machine, stopping it, changing the size, but we will see. Okay, so let's go to create the virtual machine in my subscription, choosing the location. Here we had that drop-down box. Also image, I only have one image. Therefore, the drop-down box is rather small. And I'll specify a username and a password. Give it some processor settings and then I'll be asked for adding a disk. And this is not the operating system disk, and I cannot change the size, right? I have to take what I have sysprepped, but I could have add another data disk to it. So that would be additional SCSI disks that would be added to that virtual machine of type generation 2, which would be then visible for the operating system, where you could, for example, place your application data. Next is the network interface, and this is how it should look like, right? So you add an interface, give it a name. I would suggest you give it almost the same name as the virtual machine, so that you know that it sticks together, right? Because maybe sometimes you want to delete resources and you want to identify which resources are related to each other. And by choosing the naming convention, you could tell easily, instead of figuring that out manually by checking out the resources. So that's my practice. If you don't see a network in your drop-down box here, right? It could be the case that the naming of the switch is different, sort of, right? So maybe you have, you ran into an error, or it created something, but this doesn't fit to your Hyper-V system, because I have seen people that are specifying a virtual network which has a different name from their compute switch. Or maybe you are renaming your compute switch. I don't even know what that does then. Make sure that these things stick together. Remember, you can have multiple networks that all sit on the same Hyper-V switch. The coding lines are a little bit different. Manfred, we may need to do another video here on this one. Why would you want to do this? Well, for example, if you look at this one, you don't see any VLAN tags here, right? So you can't set any VLAN tags here. If you know Hyper-V, you know that you're setting the VLAN ID not on the switch, and all the virtual machines that are attached to that switch get these VLAN addresses. No, you set the VLAN ID on the NIC the virtual machine has, right? So this would be the place. However, the Azure Resource Bridge at that stage does not allow it. The logic how it does that is you create another network. The network has the setting for the VLAN ID, right? Therefore, if a user selects, for example, the network then with a VLAN ID set behind of it, then it will create a virtual machine with a NIC that has that VLAN ID. However, there are a little bit of a different commands line that you need to do when specifying the network. Okay, I think I have it. I have it even in the code. So watch out for the section a little bit below the network that we have created, and there's a sample for an additional network that I think has a VLAN ID set there. Okay. Yep. Funny. This is an Azure deployment, and that means you can also do it template-wise, right? So it's not only using the same wizards, it's using the same Azure principle of ARM templates, right? So even there, you could copy that code and work with it like a regular ARM image, right? Not only deploying maybe one virtual machine at a time, but deploying a bunch of them. The only thing that's worth to mention here is the provider. Virtual machines that sit on top of HCI do have their own resource provider, which is called Microsoft.Azure Stack HCI/virtual machines. So this is different. If you remember the Azure Stack Hub story, right? We try to do almost as the same thing in Azure as on Azure Stack Hub. With Azure Stack HCI, it has its own namespace or its own resource provider for doing it. Okay, but yeah, so that was rather quick. So let me pause here as well. So the dialogues are the same. It should take, depending on the speed of your system, and mine is not the fastest one, but within 5 minutes I have another virtual machine, because you only do a copy job. Once the image has been copied over, you should see a virtual machine on your Hyper-V system and also in your failover cluster, because the Azure Resource Bridge takes this, assumes that the virtual machine should be, highly available and be part of your failover cluster. Yeah, let's do a log on to that box, so I at least see some things. So it has 4 virtual processors. It has 8 gig of RAMs. That's basically, how I provisioned it in the setup. And if I do okay, it takes a while. So it still thinks that the operating system is a little bit in process. So there might be sometimes a little bit time of a delay here. But if I go, for example, and do a show hidden types, that's also sometimes interesting to see, the part that is hidden away or hidden away from you. That relies, or that is part of the virtual machine, is sometimes interesting if you really need to delete everything, right? So here's the password or the user name or the user that has been created as part of the setup. And if I type correctly, the logon should work, and I'll be logged on to that box. If there is a DHCP server sitting on that network, right, then my virtual machine has an IP address. If there isn't, currently the Azure Resource Bridge does not, it's in the works as far as I know, that they, to have sort of static IP addresses. We need to, that is something that will be coming in the future, or that it's been worked on currently. Okay.
Perfect. So many steps, yes, but what I like at your script, Bernhard, is that we have this smaller pieces of steps where we always see, was it successful or not? And I've seen in your script that you had at some important steps some information about possible errors in there, what could happen or what should I do when an error happens. But I assume you tested it several times. So if the environment fits to what we described, and if you specify the values correctly, then it should work fine. And so hopefully this was helpful for you all watching this video to do your first experiences with the Azure Arc Resource Bridge for Azure Stack HCI, for deploying it. Don't be shy and afraid of this many PowerShell code lines. You don't have to type them on your own. Bernhard mentioned the GitHub repository. We will put the link to it below the video. So in the video description, you will have the direct link. You can click on it, download it, use this. And for sure, it would be smoother maybe, or for some of you, easier to have it in a graphical wizard. But we mentioned this at the beginning of this video, where I said that I had a successful deployment with the Windows Admin Center, but I have seen many unsuccessful deployments also, and it's not so easy in this huge wizard to go back. But no, in other words, it's not possible to go back when the deployment in Windows Admin Center fails. The Windows Admin Center says, oh, please clean up your environment, but the cleanup is not a button. It's a link to an article where you have to do all the steps on your own. So my real recommendation at the moment is to use this script Bernhard provided here. Yeah. So anything to add from your side, Bernhard?
No. So thanks for having me and for giving me the possibility to present this. Provide feedback. This is a functionality that that is being worked on quite a bit. So you might see or have experiences, from a preview kind of thing. So not everything is working, but I would say it's worth trying out. And hopefully the script helps you. Have fun and have a good one.
Yeah, bye.